What happens when a ruthless gang walks into a black barbershop and starts making threats, only to find a fat black man standing in their way? Watch as the gang underestimates the man because of his size and attack him. But what they don't know is that he is a retired professional boxer and spent his entire life fighting. The rhythmic buzz of clippers filled the barbershop, punctuated by bursts of laughter and chatter. Sunlight poured through the wide front windows, reflecting off the polished black and white tiles. Darius sat in his usual spot near the corner. His broad shoulders relaxed as he sipped a cup of steaming coffee. Conversations bounced around the room, a mix of sports debates and neighborhood gossip, as Jerome, the barber, worked deftly on his client's fade. "Man, I'm telling you, Ali could have danced circles around Tyson," Jerome said, his voice animated. "Ali had the skill, but Tyson had that knockout power," Darius replied, his voice deep and steady, a slight grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. The barbershop was more than a place to get a haircut. It was a sanctuary, a cornerstone of the community where stories were shared, problems were solved, and camaraderie reigned. That peace, however, was about to be shattered. The bell above the door jingled, but the air in the room shifted instantly. 3 men strode in, their swagger and sneering grins announcing their presence before they even spoke. The leader, a wiry man with pale skin and a sharp jawline, scanned the room with an air of ownership. Ethan. Flanking him were his lackeys, Jake and Brandon, their expressions smug as they trailed behind. "Afternoon, fellas," Ethan drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. He leaned on the counter, his piercing gaze sweeping over the barbershop before settling on Darius. "Nice place you got here, Jerome. Be a shame if something happened to it." Jerome stiffened, but kept his hands steady on the clippers. "We don't want any trouble, Ethan. Just let us do our thing." Ethan smirked, pulling a toothpick from his pocket and wedging it between his teeth. "Oh, there won't be trouble, long as everyone plays along. Small fee, you know, for keeping this place protected." His eyes flicked back to Darius. "Of course, some people look like they need more than protection." Jake snickered, his eyes raking over Darius with open disdain. "What's this? A heavyweight champ or just heavy?" Laughter followed, cruel and pointed. Brandon remained silent, glancing uneasily at Ethan. Darius set his coffee cup down slowly, his jaw tightening as the insults continued. "What's the matter, big guy?" Ethan taunted, taking a step closer. "You too slow to keep up, or just too tired to try?" The room went quiet, save for the faint hum of the clippers. Darius's calm gaze met Ethan's, steady and unwavering. The tension crackled in the air, heavy as a storm cloud. Ethan's smirk widened as he pulled out a crumpled flyer from his jacket pocket, slapping it onto the counter. "You see, Jerome, this neighborhood's been getting rough lately. A place like yours? It could use some insurance. My boys and I, we're all about keeping the peace." Jerome glanced at the flyer without picking it up. It was a cheaply printed ad for a supposed security service, complete with a phone number and a logo that looked like it had been designed in 5 minutes. He didn't need to read it to know what it was. A scam. Plain and simple. "We're good here," Jerome said carefully, keeping his tone even. "Always have been." Ethan chuckled, the sound low and condescending. "Oh, I don't doubt it, but, you know, things happen. A broken window here, some graffiti there. It's all so unpredictable these days. Wouldn't you feel better knowing someone's watching out for you?" Jake leaned on the counter next to Ethan, pretending to inspect the clippers and tools laid out. "Nice setup you got, man. Be a real shame if something got messed up in all the unpredictability." His grin was sharp, his words dripping with false sympathy. Darius watched the exchange quietly, his large frame still and composed, but his sharp eyes tracked every movement. The tension in the room thickened as the gang's tone became more pointed, their faux friendliness slipping. Ethan turned his attention back to Darius, tilting his head like he was sizing him up. "You're a quiet one, huh? Big guy like you, though. I bet you're all about keeping the peace, too." His voice was casual, but the underlying challenge was clear. Darius raised his coffee cup to his lips, taking a slow sip before responding. I'm about respect," he said evenly, his deep voice carrying across the room. "Something you seem to be running low on." Jake let out a low whistle. "Oh, he's got jokes. Look, man, we're just trying to be neighborly here. Keep things civil." Ethan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, civil. That's what we're all about." He stepped closer, his body language shifting from casual to confrontational. "But respect? That's earned, friend." The barber shop had gone silent, the patrons frozen as the situation edged toward something dangerous. Jerome placed his clippers down carefully, his hands shaking slightly as he stepped forward. "That's enough, Ethan. We don't need whatever it is you're selling." Ethan ignored him, his focus locked on Darius. "So, what's it gonna be? You gonna play nice? Or are we gonna have to work a little harder to convince you?" Darius placed his cup down with deliberate calm, his movements steady despite the rising tension. "I think you've overstayed your welcome." Ethan's jaw tightened, the thin veneer of friendliness cracking. The air in the room felt electric, the gang's bravado clashing with Darius's unflinching composure. The next move was coming, and everyone knew it. Ethan let out a laugh, loud and exaggerated, as if Darius had just cracked the funniest joke of the day. He stepped back slightly, gesturing to Jake and Brandon with a casual wave of his hand. "Hear that, boys? Big guy here thinks he's in charge." Jake snickered, leaning against the wall as he folded his arms. "Yeah, maybe he's planning to throw his weight around. He's got plenty to spare." Brandon chuckled uneasily, glancing at Darius, but not joining in as enthusiastically as the others. Ethan noticed, shooting him a sharp look before continuing. "You know," Ethan said, turning back to Darius, "I've always wondered how people like you let yourselves go like that. But I guess when you're used to being last in line, it doesn't really matter, huh?" The insults cut through the room like a knife. Jerome shifted uncomfortably, but Darius remained still, his calm gaze fixed on Ethan. His silence only seemed to fuel the gang's arrogance. Jake, emboldened, stepped forward. Maybe he figures, if he stays big enough, no one will bother messing with him. "Worked so far, right?" He turned to Ethan, smirking. "Until now." Ethan grinned, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Yeah, it must be rough, big guy. Always being the one people look at funny. Always being the one people cross the street to avoid." His voice dropped slightly, the mockery replaced with a venomous edge. "And always being the one who knows he's never really welcome." The air in the barber shop was heavy with tension. The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Jerome opened his mouth to say something, but Darius raised a hand, stopping him. "Let me make this real clear for you," Darius said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't own this place, and you're not going to intimidate anyone here. Take your nonsense somewhere else." Ethan's grin faltered, but only for a moment. "Oh, is that how it is? You think you're going to tell me what to do?" His tone turned mocking again. "Man, look at you, all big and bad. What are you going to do? Sit on us?" The gang erupted in laughter, their voices echoing off the walls. Brandon's laugh was quieter, more forced, as he shifted uneasily. Darius's gaze didn't waver, his stillness an unspoken challenge. "You've got one chance to walk out of here," Darius said, his voice dropping to a near growl. "Don't make me repeat myself." Ethan's eyes narrowed, the thin veneer of humor disappearing completely. "You think you scare me, big man? You don't know who you're messing with." The room was silent, except for the faint buzz of the clippers that Jerome had forgotten to turn off. The tension was palpable, every set of eyes fixed on Darius and Ethan. The gang's bravado was starting to crack, but Ethan wasn't ready to back down. The storm was about to break. Ethan leaned in closer, his sneer practically dripping venom. "You know what your problem is? People like you always think you can walk around, act like you're better than us, when we all know the truth. You're just a fat, useless—" The words barely left his mouth before Darius moved. In a blur, Darius's right hand shot forward, gripping Ethan's collar like a vice. He yanked the smaller man off balance with such force that Ethan's feet skidded across the polished floor. The room erupted into a collective gasp, the sudden shift in energy silencing even the faint buzz of the clippers. Before Ethan could react, Darius's fist connected with his jaw in a precise, devastating punch. The impact reverberated through the barbershop, the sound sharp and brutal. Ethan flew backward, slamming into one of the barber chairs, his head snapping to the side as he crumpled awkwardly against it. "Ethan!" Jake roared, his face contorted in rage. He lunged at Darius, his movements wild and uncoordinated. But Darius was ready. He sidestepped easily, his large frame moving with a speed that defied his size. As Jake stumbled past him, Darius planted a thunderous right hook into his ribs. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and Jake crumpled to the ground, gasping for air as he clutched his side. Chaos erupted. Chairs were knocked over, clippers clattered to the floor, and patrons scrambled to get out of the way. Jerome backed against the counter, his eyes wide as the scene unfolded. Ethan staggered to his feet, his hand clutching his bruised jaw. His face was a mix of shock and fury. "You're dead for this!" he spat, his voice hoarse with rage. Darius's gaze locked on him, calm and steady despite the chaos. "Come try me," he said, his voice low and deliberate, carrying an edge that sent a chill through the room. Jake, still on the ground, grabbed a nearby stool, his movements sluggish from the pain. With a growl, he swung it wildly at Darius's head. But Darius ducked effortlessly, the stool whooshing through the air as he spun around, and landed a punishing uppercut to Jake's chin. The stool flew from Jake's hands as his body collapsed back onto the floor with a heavy thud. "You got nothing!" Ethan screamed, rushing at Darius with fists flying. His punches were wild and full of anger, lacking any skill or precision. Darius blocked the first strike with his forearm, countering with a sharp jab to Ethan's nose. Blood spurted instantly, Ethan stumbling back, clutching his face as he let out a howl of pain. Darius didn't stop. He stepped forward with deliberate, measured steps, cutting off Ethan's escape. Another jab followed, this time to the gut, forcing Ethan to double over. Before he could recover, Darius delivered a crushing left hook to his temple, sending him sprawling to the floor once more. Brandon hovered near the wall, his face pale as he watched his friends fall one by one. His fists were clenched, but he didn't move to join in. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit, his loyalty clearly wavering. Jake managed to stagger to his feet, using the counter for support, but his legs were shaky, and his breathing was labored. You're gonna pay for this," he wheezed, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. Darius turned his head slowly, his dark eyes narrowing as he fixed Jake with a stare that froze him in place. "You don't know what paying is yet," Darius said, his voice as cold as steel. Jake's bravado faltered, and he grabbed a broomstick from the corner, brandishing it like a weapon. With a yell, he charged at Darius, swinging it wildly. Darius caught the stick mid-swing, his grip like iron. In one fluid motion, he yanked it from Jake's hands and broke it over his knee. The sound of the wood snapping in half was deafening. Jake staggered backward, his hands raised in a futile attempt to shield himself. Darius stepped in and delivered a brutal right cross to Jake's jaw, sending him spinning into a stack of chairs. Jake hit the floor hard, groaning in pain. Ethan crawled to his knees, his face smeared with blood and sweat. He looked up at Darius, his confidence shattered, but his hatred still burning. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice trembling. "You're a dead man." Darius loomed over him, his shadow casting across the defeated leader. "No," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's over when I say it's over." Ethan tried to scramble to his feet, but Darius landed one last crushing blow to his stomach, forcing him back down. Ethan collapsed, coughing and clutching his midsection as he gasped for air. The barbershop was silent now, except for the ragged breathing of the gang and the faint creak of the door as Brandon slipped out unnoticed. Darius stood in the center of the room, his chest rising and falling steadily. His face was calm, but his fists were still clenched. "You want to mess with me?" Darius said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. "You're gonna learn what real respect means." The barbershop door swung open with a violent crash as Ethan staggered out, clutching his ribs, his face twisted in pain and fury. He stumbled onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the scene. Behind him, Jake followed, limping and holding his jaw, while Brandon hovered uncertainly near the door, his wide eyes darting between his defeated friends and the imposing figure of Darius stepping out after them. Darius's steps were deliberate, his frame towering in the doorway. The sunlight glinted off his sweat-slicked brow, but his breathing was steady, controlled, his gaze fixed on the gang with a quiet intensity that made even passers-by stop in their tracks. A small crowd began to gather, murmurs rippling as they took in the sight of the gang's humiliation. "You think you can just walk all over us?" Ethan snarled, his voice cracking as he turned to face Darius. He spat blood onto the pavement, his posture defiant, despite the tremor in his knees. "This ain't over, you fat." Darius didn't let him finish. In 2 quick strides, he closed the distance between them. His left hand shot out, grabbing Ethan by the shirt, and with a single, powerful shove, he sent him sprawling into a parked car. The metal groaned under the impact, and Ethan crumpled to the ground, coughing and wheezing. Jake, fueled by a mix of pain and desperation, let out a guttural yell and charged at Darius from the side. He swung a length of pipe he'd picked up near the door, aiming for Darius's head. But Darius ducked with lightning speed, his years of training kicking in. He countered with a punishing uppercut that connected squarely with Jake's chin. The pipe clattered to the ground as Jake collapsed, unconscious, his body hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. Brandon took a hesitant step forward, his fists half raised, but he stopped when Darius's gaze snapped to him. There was no anger in Darius's eyes, only a steely resolve that froze Brandon in place. "You don't want this," Darius said, his voice low and firm. "Walk away." Brandon's hands dropped to his sides, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. He took a shaky step back, then another, before turning and bolting down the street, disappearing into the crowd. Ethan, groaning, dragged himself up from the pavement, his hands clutching the car for support. His face was bloodied and his shirt was torn, but his anger hadn't waned. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a switchblade, the blade snapping open with a metallic click. The crowd gasped, a ripple of fear and anticipation spreading through the onlookers. Darius stood his ground, his expression unreadable. "You don't want to do this," he warned, his voice calm but carrying a weight that seemed to hang in the air. Ethan's laugh was ragged, desperate. "Oh, I'm gonna cut you down, big man. Let's see how tough you really are." Ethan lunged, the blade gleaming as it sliced through the air. Darius pivoted on his heel, sidestepping the attack with precision, and grabbed Ethan's wrist in a crushing grip. With a swift twist, he forced Ethan to drop the knife, the blade clattering onto the pavement. Ethan cried out in pain, but Darius didn't let go. He pulled Ethan closer, his voice cold and measured. "This is your last chance," Darius said. "Walk away, or I promise you won't get back up." Ethan struggled weakly in Darius's grasp, his bravado evaporating as he stared into the older man's unflinching eyes. With a final shove, Darius sent Ethan stumbling back onto the sidewalk. Ethan collapsed onto his knees, clutching his wrist and glaring up at Darius with a mix of fear and hatred. Darius turned and walked back toward the barber shop, his movements deliberate, as if to signal the fight was over. He paused at the door and looked back over his shoulder. "Don't come back here," he said. "Next time, it won't be this easy." Ethan slumped onto the ground, his chest heaving as the crowd began to disperse. Whispers followed Darius as he stepped back inside, the barber shop buzzing with nervous energy. Jerome stood behind the counter, his hands still trembling, while the patrons looked at Darius with a mix of awe and relief. Outside, Ethan and Jake lay beaten and humiliated, their gang's reign over the neighborhood shaken to its core. The barber shop was silent as Darius stepped back inside, his broad shoulders rising and falling with each steady breath. He paused near the door, brushing a hand over his shirt to smooth out the creases. His expression was calm, but his knuckles, still reddened from the fight, told another story. Jerome broke the silence first. "Man, what the hell just happened?" His voice was shaky, disbelief written all over his face. Darius turned to him, his gaze softening. Just some punks who thought they owned the place. He walked to his chair and picked up his coffee, now lukewarm. He took a long sip, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos that had unfolded moments ago. The patrons began to murmur, their voices low but urgent. "Did you see how he handled them?" one man whispered. "They didn't stand a chance," another added, shaking his head in awe. Jerome let out a nervous laugh, running a hand over his head. "Darius, I don't know what you're made of, but that was something else. You just took down 3 guys like it was nothing." Darius gave a faint shrug, setting the empty cup on the counter. "They gave me no choice." The bell above the door jingled, drawing everyone's attention. A young woman poked her head in, her eyes wide as she scanned the room. Is it safe to come in?" she asked cautiously. Jerome waved her in, though his hand still trembled slightly. Yeah, it's fine now. Come on in." The barber shop began to settle, the patrons gradually returning to their seats and conversations, though the tension still lingered. Darius sat back in his corner, his gaze fixed on the street outside. Ethan and Jake were gone, their beaten forms having limped away moments after the crowd dispersed. But Darius knew this wasn't over. Men like Ethan didn't take a beating lightly. As if reading his mind, Jerome approached him. "You know they're gonna come back, right? Guys like that, they don't let this go." Darius nodded slowly. "I know." His voice was low, steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Resolve. "But they'll think twice before they try anything stupid again." Jerome hesitated, then placed a hand on Darius's shoulder. "You're a good man, Darius. Don't let them drag you into more trouble." Darius didn't respond immediately, his gaze still on the street. Trouble has a way of finding you, no matter how hard you try to avoid it. His voice carried a weight that silenced Jerome. Outside, Brandon lingered in the shadows of a nearby alley, his back pressed against the cold brick wall. His hands trembled as he replayed the fight in his mind. He'd seen Ethan humiliated before, but never like this. And Jake, the way Darius had dropped him so effortlessly. It made Brandon question everything. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. Should he call Ethan? Warn him to back off? Or was it time to make a different kind of call? Brandon's eyes flicked toward the barber shop one last time before he slipped further into the alley, his mind racing. He didn't know what his next move would be, but one thing was clear. The gang's grip on the neighborhood had been shaken, and Darius had drawn a line they wouldn't forget. A couple of hours had passed since the fight, but the energy in the barber shop hadn't quite returned to normal. The clippers hummed softly as Jerome worked on a customer, but his movements lacked the usual flair. A heavy tension hung in the air, broken only by the occasional glance out the window or the murmurs from lingering patrons discussing what had happened. Darius sat near the window, his broad arms crossed over his chest as he stared out into the dimming evening. The fight played over in his mind, each blow, each insult. He'd defended himself, but the unease in his gut told him this wasn't over. He caught Jerome's eye, and the barber gave him a faint nod before putting down the clippers and approaching. "You okay, man?" Jerome asked quietly, pulling up a chair next to Darius. "I'm fine," Darius replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But they'll be back. You know that." Jerome sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, they're not the type to just let this slide. Especially Ethan. Guy's got more pride than sense." The bell above the door jingled again, and this time 2 uniformed officers stepped in. Their badges glinted in the fading sunlight as they scanned the room. The older of the 2, a man with thinning hair and a weary expression, approached Darius and Jerome, while the younger officer lingered near the door, his gaze disinterested. "You Darius Cole?" the older officer asked, pulling out a small notepad. Darius nodded, unfolding his arms, but keeping his posture relaxed. "That's me. Got a call about some kind of disturbance here earlier. Care to tell us what happened?" His tone was flat, almost bored, as if this were just another box to check on his evening shift. Jerome jumped in before Darius could speak. "Those punks came in here trying to shake us down, demanding protection money, making threats. Darius here just defended himself." The officer raised an eyebrow, glancing at Darius. "Defended yourself, huh? And, by the looks of it, you put 2 guys in the hospital." "They came at me first," Darius said calmly. "I didn't throw the first punch, but I wasn't going to let them trash this place." The younger officer scoffed, crossing his arms. "Let me guess. Local gang? Yeah, we've dealt with these types before. They make noise, they cause trouble, then they vanish. Nothing to worry about." Jerome frowned. "Nothing to worry about? These guys have been hassling the neighborhood for months. They're not just gonna vanish." The older officer shrugged, jotting a few notes down without looking up. "We'll file a report, but unless they come back, or you've got evidence of a crime, there's not much we can do." Sounds like a neighborhood dispute that got out of hand. Darius's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "They pulled a knife on me." "That not enough for you?" The officer glanced up, his expression indifferent. "If they'd used it, maybe. Look, Mr. Cole, I get it. These guys are punks, but you handled it. No one's pressing charges. My advice? Let it go. Don't escalate." "Let it go?" Jerome snapped, his voice rising. "You're telling us to let it go while they're out there planning their next move?" "Calm down, sir," the younger officer said, his tone condescending. "We'll patrol the area tonight. That's all we can promise." The older officer tucked his notepad away and nodded curtly at Darius. "Like I said, file a report if they come back. Until then, stay out of trouble." With that, the officers turned and left, the bell above the door jingling faintly as they walked out. Jerome let out a string of curses under his breath, pacing the floor, while Darius remained seated, his expression unreadable. "They don't care," Jerome muttered, his hands balling into fists. "They never care, not until it's too late. They'll care when someone else gets hurt," Darius said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the window. "But I'm not waiting for that." Jerome stopped pacing and looked at him, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" Darius didn't answer immediately. His fingers tapped lightly against the arm of the chair as he watched the last of the daylight fade. "It means we have to be ready. Ethan and his crew aren't done. And when they come back, they'll be looking to do more than talk." Jerome swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "We've got your back, man. Just say the word." For the first time since the fight, Darius allowed a small, grim smile. "Let's just hope it doesn't come to that." The days after the fight at the barber shop were eerily quiet, but it was the kind of silence that weighed heavy, filled with unspoken threats and lurking danger. Darius returned to his usual routine, training at his gym, running errands in the neighborhood, and stopping by the barber shop to check in with Jerome. But the normalcy felt fragile, as though it could shatter at any moment. It started subtly, a figure lingering too long near the corner as Darius walked home one evening. A car parked across the street from the gym with its engine idling, the driver's face obscured by tinted windows. Darius would catch fleeting glimpses of people watching him, always out of the corner of his eye, always gone when he turned to look. At first, he dismissed it. The fight had left him on edge, and he chalked it up to paranoia. But when Jerome called him one morning, his voice tight with worry, Darius knew it was more than just a feeling. "They left something at the shop," Jerome said, his words clipped. "You need to come see this." When Darius arrived, Jerome was pacing outside, his usual calm replaced by an agitation that was hard to ignore. He led Darius inside, gesturing toward the counter. A single piece of paper lay there, its edges jagged as if it had been torn from a notebook. The handwriting was crude and scrawled in thick black marker. "This ain't over. Next time, we finish the job." Darius's jaw clenched as he picked up the note, his eyes scanning the words again. He glanced at Jerome. "When did this show up?" "This morning. It was shoved under the door. Jerome rubbed the back of his neck, his expression a mix of anger and fear. I checked the cameras, but whoever left it stayed out of view. Darius folded the note carefully and slid it into his pocket. Did you call the police? Jerome let out a bitter laugh. And say what? That some punks left us a threatening note? You saw how they handled it last time. They won't do anything until someone gets hurt. Darius didn't respond immediately, his mind racing. He thought of the figures he'd seen following him, the unease that had crept into his every move. Ethan and his crew weren't just licking their wounds, they were planning their next strike. The following day, the tension grew. As Darius left the gym late in the evening, he noticed the same car parked across the street. The engine roared to life as he stepped outside, and the vehicle peeled away, its tires screeching against the asphalt. It wasn't the first time he'd seen it, but now he was certain it wasn't a coincidence. Later that week, he found graffiti spray-painted on the gym's back wall. "We're watching you." The words were accompanied by a crude drawing of a fist smashing through glass. Darius stared at it for a long moment before pulling out his phone and taking a picture. He wasn't about to ignore this. By the time he returned to the barber shop that evening, the unease had settled into something heavier, an unshakable certainty that Ethan and his gang weren't just out for revenge. They wanted to make a statement. Jerome greeted him with a grim nod, the note still fresh in both their minds. "They're testing you," Jerome said, his voice low, "trying to get in your head. They're wasting their time," Darius replied, his tone steady but sharp. "They want me scared. But that's not gonna happen." Jerome frowned, leaning closer. "Yeah, but what if they go after someone else? What if they don't come at you directly?" The thought hadn't escaped Darius. He glanced at the patrons in the shop, at the people walking by outside, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. "That's why we're not waiting," he said finally. "They want me to react, so I will. But on my terms." Jerome raised an eyebrow. "You've got a plan?" Darius didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed as he looked out the window, his reflection staring back at him. "Not yet," he admitted, "but when I do, they won't see it coming." Darius leaned against the counter in the gym, his arms crossed as he stared at the graffiti on the back wall. The words felt like a challenge, an unspoken dare from Ethan and his crew. They weren't going to stop, not until they had proven their dominance or someone stopped them for good. His mind churned with possibilities, weighing risks and outcomes. This wasn't just about him anymore. Ethan and his gang were a menace to the neighborhood, and it was time to end it. He pulled out a chair and sat down, grabbing a notebook from the counter. Slowly, he began to sketch out the pieces of his plan. He muttered to himself as he wrote, his deep voice filling the quiet gym. "First step, bait." He tapped his pen against the paper. "They'll need a reason to show up, all of them. Not just Ethan and Jake. Something big enough to get them out of hiding." The idea came together as he wrote. Ethan's ego was his biggest weakness, and if Darius could play to that, he could draw the gang out. The gang thought they'd shaken him. If word spread that Darius would be at the barbershop alone late at night, it would be irresistible to Ethan. He'd see it as a chance to finish what they'd started. A final showdown to reassert his dominance. Step 2. Reinforcements. Darius smirked as he wrote the word in bold letters. This fight wasn't going to be like the last. Ethan might come expecting one man, but he'd be walking into a trap. Darius needed people he could trust, fighters who knew how to handle themselves in a brawl. He scrolled through his phone contacts, his finger stopping on a name he hadn't seen in years. Jackson Iron Jack Carter. The phone rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Darius Cole, thought you fell off the planet, man." "Not yet," Darius replied with a chuckle. "Listen, Jack, I need your help. Got a situation that needs handling." Jack didn't hesitate. "Name the time and place." Darius laid out the details. The gang, their threats, and the escalating harassment. "I want them to come to the barbershop tomorrow night. They'll think I'm alone, but I need backup. People who can handle themselves. Think you can bring a few of the old crew?" Jack's laugh was like gravel. "Oh, I've got more than a few in mind. Tyrone, Victor, Malik. They'll jump at the chance to help. They've been itching for action. Perfect, Darius said. We'll keep it contained. No weapons, no civilians getting hurt. Just a clean fight to put them down and make sure the cops have enough to lock them up. Cops? Jack asked, his tone cautious. Darius nodded, though Jack couldn't see it. Yeah, I'll call them once it starts. By the time it's over, Ethan and his crew will be too beaten to resist. Jack let out a low whistle. You've always been a strategic guy, Darius. We'll be there. After ending the call, Darius turned back to his notebook. He underlined a final word at the bottom of the page. Timing. He would have Jerome spread the word, making it seem like a casual slip-up. Darius will be closing up the shop late tomorrow. Alone. Ethan would take the bait. But the timing had to be perfect. The fighters would arrive early and stay out of sight until the gang was inside. Once the door closed, there'd be no escape. That night, Darius met with Jerome at the barber shop to finalize the plan. Jerome was skeptical at first, pacing nervously as Darius explained. You're sure about this? He asked, his voice tight with worry. I'm sure, Darius said firmly. This is the only way to stop them. They're too cocky to see it coming. Jerome sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, I'll let the word out. But man, you better be ready. Those guys fight dirty. Darius smiled faintly. So do we. As Jerome left, Darius stayed behind, staring at the barber shop's familiar walls. Tomorrow, this place would become a battleground. He wasn't afraid of the fight. He'd faced worse in the ring. But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the neighborhood, about sending a message that people like Ethan couldn't bully their way to control. Tomorrow night, it would end. The day passed slowly, each hour dragging as if the universe itself were holding its breath. Darius spent the afternoon preparing, replaying the plan in his mind like a fight sequence he'd practiced 1,000 times. Timing, placement, and precision. Every element had to be perfect. This wasn't about proving a point anymore. It was about ending a threat that had pushed too far. By early evening, he returned to the barber shop. The place felt quieter than usual, the low hum of the fluorescent lights adding to the unease. Jerome was behind the counter, nervously polishing clippers that didn't need polishing. His movements were jittery, and he kept glancing at the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. They'll come, Jerome said, breaking the silence. His voice was tight, his eyes flicking toward Darius. Guys like them, they don't let something like this go. Not after what you did to them. Darius nodded slowly. They'll come, and they'll bring more this time. Jake's bruised ribs, Ethan's fractured nose, the humiliation etched into their faces as they limped away from the last fight. It was a debt they intended to settle. Darius could see it in their eyes that day, the way they spat promises of revenge, even as they staggered away. He'd been ready then, and he was ready now. Maybe I should stay, Jerome offered, though his voice wavered. Just in case you need backup. Darius shook his head. You've done enough. Go home. I need you clear of this when it goes down. Jerome hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, setting the clippers down and grabbing his coat. Just be careful, man. You've got the whole neighborhood counting on you. I will, Darius said, watching Jerome leave. The door jingled shut, leaving the shop cloaked in silence. The hours crawled by. Darius kept the lights low, the only illumination coming from the street lamp outside. His old friends, Jack, Tyrone, Victor, and Malik, were already stationed nearby, hidden in alleys and parked cars. Each one was a seasoned fighter, and Darius trusted them to handle what was coming. At 10:43 p.m., the first sign came. A shadow moved under the street lamp, deliberate and slow. Then another. Ethan and Jake stepped into view, their postures tense but defiant. Jake clutched his side as if the pain from Darius's punch still lingered, but his grin was sharper than before. A predator, cornered and desperate. Ethan's nose was still bandaged, the bruising around his eyes a reminder of his earlier humiliation. They weren't here just to intimidate. They were here to finish what they'd started. 3 younger men flanked them, their cocky struts betraying their inexperience. One carried a crowbar, another a length of chain. 10 in total, just as Darius had expected. Ethan stopped short of the door, his eyes scanning the shop's dim interior. He leaned toward Jake, muttering something inaudible. Jake nodded, pulling a baseball bat from under his coat. Ethan smirked, stepping forward, his swagger forced but determined. The door creaked open, and Ethan entered first. His eyes locked onto Darius immediately, standing near the counter, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the dim light. "Well, well," Ethan said, his voice thick with mockery. "Look who's waiting for us. Thought you'd be running scared after last time." Darius's eyes flicked to Jake, who was limping slightly as he followed. "Figured you'd show up eventually," Darius said calmly. Jake's grin twisted into something uglier. "Oh, we showed up all right, and this time we brought enough to make sure you don't get up." Ethan gestured to the others. "You made a fool out of us, Cole. Broke my damn nose." Hurt Jake pretty bad, too. He stepped closer, his tone growing darker. "We're here to settle up." Darius's expression didn't change, his calm demeanor unnerving in the face of their anger. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked quietly. "You're not walking out of here if you start something." Ethan barked a laugh, motioning for Jake to close the door. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed ominously. "Oh, we're not walking out," Ethan sneered. "We're carrying you out." Darius's hand moved to his phone on the counter, the screen lighting up as he tapped a button. Outside, footsteps echoed on the pavement, deliberate and steady. The sound of car doors opening cut through the still night. Ethan's smirk faltered as shadows moved outside the glass. Jack, Tyrone, Victor, and Malik stepped into view, their silhouettes unmistakable. Each of them carried the quiet confidence of men who knew exactly how to handle a fight. "What the hell?" Jake started, but his words trailed off as the realization dawned. Darius straightened, his broad frame casting a shadow across the room. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "You wanted a fight? You've got one. Let's finish this." The barbershop felt smaller now, the air heavy with tension as Ethan's crew fanned out. 10 men in total. Ethan stood at the center, flanked by Jake and 3 others who carried weapons: a bat, a crowbar, and a length of chain. The remaining 5 spread out across the room, their faces a mix of cocky smirks and grim determination. The fluorescent lights overhead cast sharp shadows on their tense expressions, highlighting the simmering anger that drove them here. Outside, Darius's reinforcements stood in the glow of the street lamp. Jack, Tyrone, Victor, and Malik. 4 men, each seasoned and unshaken. Though outnumbered, their quiet confidence and years of experience carried an undeniable weight. Through the glass, Jack met Darius's gaze with a subtle nod, a silent assurance that they were ready. Ethan's sneer deepened as he glanced toward the figures outside. "You think 4 washed-up boxers are going to save you, Cole?" he spat. "You're still outnumbered. 10 to 5. Those odds don't look so good for you." Darius didn't flinch. "You brought 10, he said evenly, his voice calm and deliberate. "But only one of you has the guts to start this." Ethan's nostrils flared, but he didn't respond immediately. Jake, standing to his right, shifted his bat from one hand to the other, his movements twitchy with anticipation. "We're here for payback," Jake growled, his voice cutting through the silence. "For every busted rib, every bruise. You think you can humiliate us and get away with it?" One of the younger gang members, a wiry man gripping the chain, laughed nervously. "Ain't no way you're walking out of here after this," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The others began to echo his sentiment, their bravado filling the space as they circled closer. Darius scanned the room, his years in the ring allowing him to read every twitch and shift in their movements. They were posturing, trying to intimidate, but the tighter the circle grew, the more their nerves showed. 10 men or not, they didn't have the discipline or experience to control their fear. "You're out of your depth," Darius said, his voice steady. "You've got numbers, sure, but numbers don't win fights. Skill does." Ethan let out a sharp laugh, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." He gestured to his crew, who moved closer, tightening the circle around Darius. Outside, Jack, Tyrone, Victor, and Malik stood motionless, their expressions unreadable. Each of them was a veteran of countless fights, their experience a stark contrast to the gang's chaotic energy. They were outnumbered, but they weren't outmatched. Ethan's lip curled as he gestured toward the door. "You really think your 4 buddies out there are going to do anything? We'll take care of you first, then them." Darius tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking on Ethan. "You brought 10 men to fight one. That says a lot about you." The comment hit its mark. Ethan's face darkened, and his grip on his side, still bruised from their last encounter, tightened. "Enough talk," he snarled. "Get him!" The men hesitated for a brief moment, their weapons shifting as they gauged who would move first. Jake took a step forward, his bat raised, his eyes burning with hatred. "You're going down, old man," he growled. Darius's lips curled into a faint smile, calm and steady despite the tension. "Then come on!" Jake lunged, swinging the bat in a wide arc. Darius sidestepped effortlessly, his body moving with the grace of a seasoned fighter. The bat whistled past him, and before Jake could recover, Darius countered with a quick, devastating right hook to his ribs. Jake let out a pained grunt, staggering back as the others closed in. Ethan shouted orders, his voice cracking as he barked, "Move! Surround him!" The gang surged forward, their weapons raised, their numbers pressing in. Darius shifted his stance, his fists raised, his gaze sharp. Outside, Jack and the others tensed, ready to join the fray at the first signal. The storm was about to break. The barber shop erupted into chaos as the gang surged forward, their weapons raised and fury driving their movements. Darius ducked under a wide swing from Jake's bat, countering with a sharp right hook to the ribs that forced Jake to stagger back. But before he could press his advantage, another gang member charged, wielding a length of chain with wild, erratic swings that kept Darius on the defensive. Outside, Jack, Tyrone, Victor, and Malik exchanged quick glances. They could see the escalating chaos inside, and Jack didn't hesitate. "We're going in," he growled, stepping forward and pushing open the door with force. The others followed, their expressions grim as they entered the fray. The gang hesitated for a moment as the reinforcements entered, their faces twisting with a mix of frustration and fear. But Ethan's shout cut through the noise. "Don't stop! There's only 5 of them!" Jack wasted no time. He barreled into one of the gang members closest to the door, grabbing the man by his shirt and slamming him against the wall with a force that rattled the clippers on the counter. The man swung at him with a crowbar, but Jack caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting it sharply until the weapon clattered to the ground. "Stay down!" Jack growled, delivering a punishing uppercut that left the man crumpled in the corner. Tyrone, towering and powerful, faced 2 attackers who advanced with makeshift weapons. One jabbed at him with a pipe, while the other tried to flank him with a chair. Tyrone sidestepped the pipe strike and grabbed the chair mid-swing, yanking it out of the attacker's hands and shoving him backward into the counter. The other attacker lunged again, but Tyrone countered with a devastating left hook, sending the man sprawling. Meanwhile, Victor's speed kept him moving fluidly through the fray. A chain-wielding gang member came at him, but Victor ducked low and delivered a quick jab to the man's ribs. The attacker swung wildly, trying to catch Victor off guard, but Victor stayed 1 step ahead, landing a sharp kick to the man's knee that sent him to the floor. Malik moved with precision, grappling a larger gang member who was trying to corner him near the chairs. The man threw a clumsy punch, but Malik caught his arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him down. With a swift knee to the gut, Malik disarmed him, tossing his weapon aside before delivering a knockout blow. But the gang wasn't going down easily. Their numbers kept the fight chaotic, with Darius and his team constantly shifting to counter new threats. Ethan stayed near the center, shouting orders and directing his men. "Don't let up! Surround them!" Darius found himself facing 2 attackers at once, their swings coordinated as they tried to corner him. He dodged a bat aimed at his ribs, countering with a jab that knocked the weapon out of one man's hands. But the second attacker used the opening to land a glancing blow to Darius's side with a pipe. Darius grunted, the pain sharp, but not enough to slow him down. He retaliated with a hook that sent the second man stumbling into a chair, temporarily out of the fight. Across the room, Jack and Tyrone worked back to back, fending off multiple attackers. Jack caught a punch aimed at his jaw, twisting the man's arm and throwing him into another gang member. Tyrone swung a powerful elbow into the side of an attacker's head, but the man stayed standing, grappling Tyrone in an attempt to overpower him. Victor was momentarily pinned against the counter as two gang members closed in, their weapons raised. He darted to the side at the last second, causing the bat and chain to collide with the counter instead of him. Using the opening, Victor delivered a spinning kick that knocked one attacker into the other, buying himself a moment to breathe. Malik grappled with a larger opponent, their movements locked in a brutal struggle. The gang member managed to shove Malik against the wall, but Malik used the momentum to spin out of the grip, landing a sharp elbow to the man's jaw. The attacker staggered, but another gang member rushed in, forcing Malik to shift focus. Despite their skill, the boxers were being tested. The gang's sheer numbers and desperation kept the fight unpredictable. Darius glanced at his team, seeing them hold their ground but noticing the strain beginning to show. The gang, though battered and bruised, wasn't giving up, their anger driving them forward. The room was filled with the clash of fists, the scrape of metal, and the shouts of men locked in a fight where neither side seemed to gain the upper hand. Darius squared off against another attacker, his stance steady, but his breathing heavier now. The fight wasn't just physical, it was a battle of wills, and the outcome remained uncertain. The barbershop had become a storm of bodies and chaos, the clash of blows and sharp cries echoing off the walls. Sweat and tension hung thick in the air, every movement calculated but increasingly desperate. Despite their superior skills, Darius and his team were struggling to control the relentless onslaught of Ethan's gang. Jack, a pillar of strength in the chaos, held his ground near the center of the room. His powerful strikes landed with punishing force, but he was beginning to tire. A younger gang member darted toward him, swinging a crowbar in a tight arc aimed at Jack's ribs. Jack caught the blow on his forearm, wincing but staying steady. He responded with a straight punch to the man's sternum, sending him sprawling into the counter. Before Jack could turn, another attacker charged, shoving him back a step. Jack pivoted, slamming the man into a nearby chair, but the relentless attacks were taking their toll. Nearby, Tyrone had his hands full with two gang members who coordinated their swings to keep him on the defensive. One jabbed with a pipe, forcing Tyrone to duck, while the other tried to sweep his legs with a chair leg. Tyrone leaped back just in time, his chest heaving as he sized up his opponents. "You boys aren't making this easy," he muttered, cracking his neck. When they advanced again, he lunged forward, grabbing the pipe and using it to block the second attacker's swing. With a quick pivot, he shoved both men back, creating a momentary reprieve. Victor, the quickest of the group, was constantly moving, his speed keeping him one step ahead of his attackers. He dodged a wild swing from a bat and landed a sharp jab to the attacker's jaw, but a second gang member rushed him, forcing Victor to retreat toward the back wall. As the two men closed in, Victor feinted to the left, using the narrow space to his advantage. He ducked under a swing and countered with a spinning kick that sent one man crashing into a barber chair. The other lunged again, but Victor slipped past him, his movements fluid despite the pressure. Malik found himself grappling with a particularly large gang member who outweighed him by at least 50 pounds. The man pinned Malik against the wall, his fists hammering down with brute force. Malik blocked the blows as best he could, his arms absorbing the hits, before twisting free and landing a sharp elbow to the man's temple. The attacker staggered, but Malik's moment of triumph was short-lived as another gang member closed in with a chain. Malik ducked under the swing and grabbed the chain, yanking it hard and using it to pull the man off balance. Darius, meanwhile, was locked in a brutal exchange with Ethan himself. Ethan's knife flashed in the dim light as he slashed wildly, his strikes lacking precision but fueled by rage. Darius dodged each attempt, his movements calculated and deliberate. "You're not walking out of here," Ethan snarled, his voice a mix of fury and desperation. "We'll see," Darius replied, his tone calm but firm. He sidestepped another slash, using his forearm to deflect Ethan's arm, and countered with a solid jab to Ethan's midsection. Ethan stumbled but recovered quickly, swinging again in a desperate arc that forced Darius to duck. Despite their efforts, the gang was relentless, their sheer numbers keeping the fight unpredictable. For every attacker subdued, another seemed to step up, their determination fueled by Ethan's unyielding fury. The boxers fought valiantly, their skills shining through in every exchange. But even they were beginning to show signs of fatigue. Ethan's voice cut through the chaos as he barked orders, his knife still clutched tightly in his hand. "Don't stop! Keep pressing! They're breaking!" But Darius's team wasn't breaking. They were adapting. Jack and Tyrone shifted their positions, moving closer to cover each other's backs. Victor and Malik worked to separate the gang, isolating attackers and picking them off one by one. And Darius, his breathing steady despite the grueling fight, kept Ethan occupied, his strikes measured and precise. The barbershop was a battlefield, and for every inch gained, another was contested. Neither side seemed to gain the upper hand, the outcome teetering on a knife's edge. The sirens outside grew louder, their wail cutting through the noise and signaling that time was running out. Darius's gaze flicked toward his team, their determination mirroring his own. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a test of endurance, skill, and willpower. And no matter how many opponents came at him, Darius knew one thing: they weren't going to back down. The tide of the fight began to shift as the boxers found their rhythm, their years of training and experience becoming the deciding factor against the gang's chaos. Though outnumbered, they fought with precision and coordination, each movement deliberate, every strike landing with punishing accuracy. Jack, blood trickling from a cut above his brow, let out a deep, steadying breath as he faced two attackers. One swung a crowbar, the other a bat, their strikes coming fast but wild. Jack stepped inside the crowbar's arc, catching the attacker off guard, and drove his shoulder into the man's chest with the force of a battering ram. The man hit the ground with a grunt, his crowbar clattering away. Before the second attacker could react, Jack pivoted, landing a devastating left hook to the man's jaw that sent him spinning into the wall. "Stay down!" Jack growled, his voice like gravel as he moved to back up Tyrone. Tyrone was surrounded by 3 gang members, their coordination improving as they circled him. One jabbed at his ribs with a pipe, while another swung a chair at his back. But Tyrone was ready. He deflected the pipe with his forearm, grabbed the chair mid-swing, and used it as a shield against the third attacker's bat. With a roar, he shoved the chair forward, knocking 2 of them off balance, and followed with a powerful uppercut that left one sprawled on the ground. "2 more down!" Tyrone called out, his voice booming over the noise. Victor, quick on his feet, darted between 2 attackers, his fists a blur as he targeted their weak points. One man swung a bat, aiming for Victor's head, but Victor ducked and countered with a series of body blows that left the attacker gasping for air. The second attacker tried to corner him with a chain, but Victor sidestepped, grabbing the chain and yanking it hard enough to pull the man forward. A spinning kick to the side of the head sent him tumbling into a pile of chairs. Malik was a whirlwind, his MMA training allowing him to adapt to the chaotic environment. One gang member lunged at him with a knife, but Malik parried the strike, locking the man's arm and twisting it until the knife dropped. With a quick knee to the man's stomach, Malik flipped him onto the ground and turned just in time to block a second attacker with his forearm. A swift elbow to the temple left the man dazed, giving Malik the upper hand. Darius, still locked in a brutal exchange with Ethan, could feel the shift. Ethan's strikes grew slower, his movements less controlled as frustration took hold. Darius sidestepped a wild slash and landed a clean jab to Ethan's shoulder, forcing him to drop the knife. Ethan cursed loudly, retreating a step as he clutched his arm. "You're losing," Darius said, his voice steady despite the sweat dripping down his face. "Call it off." "Never!" Ethan spat, his face twisted with rage. "I'll finish you myself." Ethan lunged at Darius with bare fists, but Darius caught him mid-charge, twisting him around and pinning him against the counter. "You're done," Darius said coldly, his grip ironclad. Across the room, the remaining gang members faltered. Their numbers had dwindled, their earlier bravado replaced by panic as they watched their comrades fall one by one. Jack and Tyrone closed in, their sheer presence forcing the last few attackers to backpedal. Victor and Malik pressed their advantage, isolating stragglers and taking them down with surgical precision. One gang member dropped his weapon and raised his hands, his face pale. "I'm out!" he shouted, stepping back toward the door. The others hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who was still pinned by Darius. "Run if you want," Jack said, his voice low and menacing. "But the cops are already on their way. You're not getting far." The remaining gang members froze, the sound of sirens now unmistakable as they closed in. Panic set in, and two more dropped their weapons, bolting toward the back exit. Malik moved to intercept, but stopped when Darius raised a hand. "Let them go," Darius said. "The ones who stay will answer for this." Ethan struggled in Darius's grip, his face red with fury. "This isn't over," he growled, though his voice lacked conviction. "It is for you," Darius replied, releasing Ethan and stepping back just as the police lights flashed outside. Ethan collapsed onto the floor, coughing and glaring up at Darius with unbridled hatred. The fight was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The flashing red and blue lights spilled into the barber shop, casting sharp, shifting shadows across the battered interior. The wail of sirens drowned out the lingering groans of the defeated gang members. Darius stood near the center of the shop, his broad chest rising and falling steadily, his fists still clenched as he surveyed the aftermath. Ethan sat slumped against the counter, clutching his ribs and glaring daggers at Darius. The knife he had wielded lay forgotten on the floor, a silent testament to his failed attempt at control. Around him, his gang was in disarray. Some sprawled on the ground, others nursing injuries, and a few too stunned to move. The boxers, though battered and breathing heavily, stood victorious, their sharp eyes fixed on the shattered remains of Ethan's crew. The door burst open, and two officers stormed in, their hands hovering near their holsters. They paused, taking in the scene. The overturned chairs, the scattered weapons, and the defeated men sprawled across the floor. The lead officer, a stocky man with graying hair, narrowed his eyes as he stepped further inside. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded, his gaze locking on Darius. Darius straightened, his imposing frame towering over the officer. "They came looking for trouble," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the tension still lingering in the air. "We just finished it." The officer's eyes flicked to Ethan, who groaned and shifted against the counter. "Ethan Doyle," he muttered, his tone a mix of recognition and disdain. "Of course. You couldn't just stay out of trouble, could you?" Ethan didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he avoided the officer's gaze. Darius folded his arms, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You knew they were terrorizing this neighborhood. People told you. We told you. And you did nothing." The officer's expression darkened, his posture stiffening. "We don't have the resources to chase down every claim," he said sharply. "But this is a little hard to ignore." Jack stepped forward, his arms crossed and his expression calm but firm. "We didn't start this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the truth, "but we made sure it ended." The officer glanced at Jack, taking in his size and the steady authority in his tone. "And you are?" "Back up," Jack replied simply. The officer let out a low sigh, clearly piecing together what had happened. "We've been after these guys for months," he muttered. "Extortion, assault, vandalism, you name it. Looks like you handed us a hell of a cleanup." Darius stepped closer, his gaze hard. "We didn't do this for you. We did this for the people who live here. But now it's your turn to finish the job." The officer met Darius's eyes, then nodded slowly. "Looks like it is." Ethan, now being hauled to his feet by the other officer, spat blood onto the floor. "This isn't over," he growled, though his voice lacked conviction. His hatred for Darius burned in his glare, but there was no fire left in his body to act on it. "It is for you," Darius replied coldly. "You just don't know it yet." The officer shoved Ethan toward the door, his cuffed hands clinking behind him. "Get him out of here," the officer ordered, his voice sharp, "and make sure he doesn't see daylight for a long time." As the gang was rounded up and escorted out, the barber shop began to quiet. Jack wiped his brow with the back of his hand, glancing around the wreckage. "Hell of a fight," he said, his tone light, despite the tension still lingering in the room. Victor chuckled, leaning against the counter. "A little more intense than sparring practice." Malik shook his head, his grin faint but present. "You call this intense? This was just a warm-up." Darius let out a tired breath, his gaze moving to the shattered chairs and scattered weapons. "This neighborhood deserves better than them," he said quietly. "Tonight, we gave it a chance." Jack clapped a hand on Darius's shoulder. "You led the charge, Cole. They'll remember that." Outside, the sirens began to fade, as the last of the gang was loaded into patrol cars. The barber shop, though battered, felt lighter now, its peace restored. Darius looked around at his team, each man standing tall despite their bruises and fatigue. "We did what we had to do," Darius said. "Now, let's clean this up." The barber shop was quiet now, save for the faint creak of chairs being righted and the occasional scrape of a broom against the tile floor. The adrenaline of the fight had faded, leaving behind the aches and bruises that came with it. Darius leaned on the counter, his large frame still imposing despite the exhaustion etched into his features. Jack picked up a broken chair leg, tossing it into a growing pile of debris by the door. "This place took a beating," he said, glancing around at the shattered remains of what had once been a tidy, welcoming space. "You sure it's worth fixing up? It's not just a shop," Darius replied, his tone quiet but firm. "It's part of the neighborhood. People need this place." The front door jingled softly, and Jerome stepped inside, his expression tense. His eyes swept over the damage, lingering on the broken chairs, the scattered clippers, and the faint smudges of blood still visible on the floor. "Damn," he muttered, running a hand over his head. "What the hell did you do to my shop?" Darius straightened, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Saved it." Jerome's gaze shifted to the pile of broken furniture, then to Darius's bruised face. After a moment, he let out a heavy sigh. "Yeah, I guess you did." Victor, broom in hand, grinned as he swept up shards of glass. "It was a hell of a show, Jerome. You should have seen it." Jerome shook his head, though a flicker of gratitude crossed his face. "I didn't need a show. I needed those guys gone." "They are gone," Darius said, his voice steady, "and they're not coming back." Jerome stepped further into the shop, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he took in the scene. "You didn't have to do this, Darius," he said quietly. "You're not even part of this place. You're just a friend." Darius interrupted, his gaze meeting Jerome's. "That's enough." Jerome nodded, a small, appreciative smile breaking through his tension. "Yeah, it is." As they worked, a few people from the neighborhood drifted in, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. An older woman with a cane peered through the window before stepping inside. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice quivering slightly. Jerome gestured toward Darius. "This guy and his friends took care of a problem." The woman's eyes widened as she looked at Darius. "You're the one who stood up to those punks?" she asked, her voice filled with both admiration and disbelief. Darius nodded, brushing dust off his hands. "Wasn't just me. We did it together." "Thank you," she said, her tone earnest. "Those men have been a plague on this neighborhood. You don't know how much this means to us." Others followed, offering thanks and helping where they could. A young man brought in a fresh broom from a nearby store, while a couple of teenagers worked together to move broken chairs out to the curb. The barber shop buzzed with quiet energy as the neighborhood rallied to restore what had been damaged. Jerome leaned against the counter, watching the scene with a faint smile. "Guess it's true what they say," he murmured. "This place really does belong to everyone." Darius, wiping down a smudge on the mirror, glanced over his shoulder. It's not just the shop, Jerome. It's the people. That's what makes it worth fighting for. The sun had started to rise by the time the shop was clean enough to function again. The chairs were set upright, the tools neatly arranged, and the floor swept clear of debris. Though some damage remained, the barbershop felt lighter, its spirit intact. Jerome clapped a hand on Darius's shoulder as they stood by the door. "You ever get tired of whatever you're doing? You've got a spot here," he said with a grin. Darius chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm good where I am, but I'll always be around if you need me." As the neighborhood began to stir with the day's activity, the barbershop stood as a quiet reminder of what had been fought for and won. The people who passed by nodded to Darius, their gratitude unspoken but clear, and for the first time in a long while, the block felt safe. The next morning, the barbershop door swung open, and Jerome found himself face to face with a group of neighbors standing on the sidewalk. Word had spread quickly about what had happened the night before, and the small crowd outside the shop seemed to grow with each passing hour. They came carrying supplies, wood planks, paint cans, brushes, even a toolbox or two. Jerome stepped out onto the stoop, blinking at the sunlight and the unexpected gathering. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice touched with surprise. A middle-aged man near the front, dressed in a faded work shirt and holding a hammer, stepped forward. "You fought for this place," he said simply. "Now it's our turn to help you rebuild." Behind him, a woman with 2 young children smiled as she handed Jerome a tray of pastries. "You've been cutting my son's hair since he was 4. The least we can do is help." Jerome turned back toward the shop where Darius and the other boxers were inside, still clearing away the last of the debris. "Hey, Darius," Jerome called. "You might want to see this." Darius emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. He paused in the doorway, his brow furrowing as he took in the scene. People were unloading materials from their cars, chatting animatedly as they began organizing supplies. Someone had even brought a cooler filled with bottled water. "You didn't tell them to come, did you?" Darius asked, glancing at Jerome. Jerome shook his head. "Nope, guess they decided this shop means as much to them as it does to us." The energy on the street was infectious. One man climbed a ladder, inspecting a crack in the shop's sign. "We'll get this fixed up in no time," he said confidently, waving a power drill. Another group began sanding down a section of wall where graffiti had been sprayed during the fight. The children painted boards with bright, cheerful designs, their laughter filling the air. Darius leaned against the doorframe, watching as the neighborhood came alive with purpose. An elderly woman approached him, clutching a small envelope. "This is for you," she said, pressing it into his hand. Darius opened it cautiously and found a simple note. "Thank you for protecting us." Inside was a crisp $20 bill. "I can't take this," Darius said, shaking his head. "You already did more than enough," the woman replied firmly. "Let us give something back." Victor, watching from the counter, grinned. "Looks like you're a local hero now, Darius." "Hero," Darius repeated with a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Just did what needed to be done." By midday, the shop was buzzing with activity. Jack worked alongside a group of teenagers, replacing the broken glass in the front window. Tyrone directed a crew of neighbors as they hammered together new shelves for the waiting area. Malik helped paint the walls, chatting with kids about the fight in tones that made them gasp and laugh. Jerome stood near the door, a clipboard in hand as he tried to keep track of everyone's contributions. "If we keep this up," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "this place is going to look better than it did before." "It's more than the shop," Darius said quietly, stepping up beside him. "It's the people. They're reclaiming what those guys tried to take." As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the shop looked transformed. The sign had been patched and repainted, the walls were clean, and the chairs were repaired and polished to a shine. Outside, the neighbors lingered, sharing stories and laughing as they admired their work. Jerome turned to Darius, his expression lighter than it had been in weeks. "This place belongs to the neighborhood," he said, "but it wouldn't have made it without you." Darius shrugged, his tone humble. "I'm just glad I could help." One of the kids tugged at his sleeve. "Hey, Mr. Darius," she said, her eyes wide with admiration, "you gonna stay and keep us safe?" Darius crouched to meet her gaze, a faint smile softening his rugged features. "You've got plenty of people here to keep you safe," he said, "but I'll always be around if you need me." As the crowd began to disperse, Darius stood in the doorway of the shop, watching the street as the neighborhood settled into a quieter rhythm. He didn't need applause or recognition. The sight of a community coming together to rebuild something that mattered, that was enough. As the barbershop lights dimmed, casting a warm glow onto the quiet street, Darius sat alone in one of the repaired chairs. His broad shoulders slouched slightly as he stared at his reflection in the mirror. The shop was nearly back to its former glory, thanks to the neighborhood's collective effort. But his mind wasn't on the fresh paint or the polished chairs. It was on the echoes of the past, the fights, the struggles, and the choices that had brought him here. The faint hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence as he leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. He thought of the ring, the countless fights he'd fought for glory and survival. Those battles had been about him, about proving he was the strongest, the fastest, the best. But this fight, the one that had left him bruised and exhausted, had been different. It wasn't about glory, it was about standing up for something bigger than himself. Jerome entered quietly, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Figured you'd still be here," he said, handing one to Darius before sitting across from him. "Can't imagine what's going through your head right now." Darius sipped the coffee, letting the warmth settle him before he spoke. "Just thinking about how things change," he said finally. "Back in the day, I fought because I had to. For money, for respect, for survival. This time, it wasn't about me." Jerome nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "That's what makes it different, and why it mattered." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Jerome set his mug down. "So you hear what happened to Ethan and his crew?" Darius raised an eyebrow but didn't answer, letting Jerome fill the space. "Police got them on everything. Assault, extortion, you name it. Some of them are already talking, trying to cut deals. Ethan, though," Jerome shook his head, "he's going away for a long time. The DA's making sure of that." Darius exhaled slowly, the weight of the news settling over him. "Good. The neighborhood deserves peace." Jerome smiled faintly. "And you gave it to them." Darius shook his head, his voice quiet but firm. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who showed up. This place isn't about one person. It's about the people who make it what it is." Jerome leaned back, a knowing smile on his face. "You ever think about sticking around? Seems like the neighborhood could use someone like you." Darius chuckled, the sound low and rumbling. "You've got this, Jerome. The neighborhood has this. I'll always be around, but I don't need to be the face of it. This is your place." The door jingled softly as someone passed by outside, the evening air carrying faint sounds of laughter and conversation. Darius glanced out the window, watching the familiar faces of neighbors who now walked with a little more confidence, their steps lighter without the shadow of Ethan's gang looming over them. He stood, stretching his sore muscles, and set his mug down on the counter. "I should get going," he said, his voice steady but tired, "but you know where to find me if you need anything." Jerome rose, extending a hand. "Thanks, Darius, for everything." Darius clasped his hand firmly, offering a faint smile. "Take care of this place. It's worth fighting for." As he stepped out into the cool night, the streetlights cast long shadows that danced along the sidewalk. The neighborhood felt different now. Not just safer, but stronger. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing against the quiet buildings, each step a reminder of the fight that had left him bruised but fulfilled. Darius didn't look back. He didn't need to. The barber shop, the neighborhood, and the people would carry forward, their scars a testament to what they'd overcome. And for Darius, that was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.